everybody, welcome back to Bubbles and Splash. Oh my goodness, it feels like this week has been so long, and it is so long since I spoke to you, but it's been just like any other week. Now, you'll notice I'm not in my usual story corner. And why is that? Well, we are in the middle of moving house. So where you'd normally see me over in the corner over there are loads of boxes, because we're going to be moving from this house into a new one. So I'm sat here in my armchair instead this week to tell you a story about David. Now, who remembers what our story last week was? Do you remember? It was about somebody who was very, 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 very tall. Can you remember his name? It was a strange one. It's not a name we have these days. He was called Goliath the giant. And then, do you remember there was a little boy called David? Because we talked about the fact that he went to take his lunch to his brothers. And while he was there, he decided, I know, I'll fight the giant. And everybody thought that was a bit strange because, well, he was only a little boy and the giant was massive. Do you remember we said if you looked up to the ceiling of the room you're in and then even higher than that, he wouldn't be able to get through your door. He'd be half the height of your house probably. Well, if you remember, David, the little boy, he took just some little stones and they put them in his sling, and he swung his sling round and round and round and round, and the stone went up, 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 and it hit the giant Goliath on the head right between the eyes, and down he tumbled dead. Well, after that, David was a little bit of a hero. And our story follows on after that. Our story today is about David when he was a little bit older. Now, if you remember when David went to see his brothers on the battlefield, and he went to see King Saul, because King Saul was like the leader of the army as the king. And do you remember King Saul offered him his armour, and David put the armour on, and he was like, oh, it's too big, it's too big. Well, after he'd killed Goliath and various things happened, he went to work for Saul in the palace. And he would play music for Saul. And while he was there, he met Saul's son, Jonathan. And David and Jonathan became the best of friends. And as David grew up, he played his music for Saul, and he became a soldier in Saul's army as well, just like his brothers had been. And he became a really, really good soldier. And do you know what happened? Saul, the king, became really jealous of David. He wanted to be just like him. He wanted to be as good a fighter as David. And he wanted to be as good with his sword as David was. And as good as his bow and arrow as David was. And he was really jealous because he wasn't as good as David was. And so he got that he was actually quite angry with David. It wasn't David's fault. He was just learning and being good. But Saul started to get quite angry with him. And Jonathan and David were friends. And so one day, David said to Jonathan, he said, oh, I'm really worried, he said, because your dad gets really angry with me. And he said, I'm scared that he's going to hurt me or he's going to kill me. And Jonathan said to David, he said, don't be silly. My dad's not going to do that. And David was like, he said, I'm not so sure. He said, he's really jealous of how good I've become, how good a soldier I've become. And I'm really scared. So the two of them, they hatched up a plan. So Jonathan said to David, he said, right, okay, I know what we'll do. He said, you know that field outside of town? He said, and you know there's a massive big stone in the middle of it. He said, well, you go and hide behind that stone. And in 3 days, I'm going to come out with my bow and arrow like this. He said, I'm going to come out with my bow and arrow and I'm going to fire some arrows into the field. He said, I'm going to bring my servant with me. And if I say to my servant, oh, look, go and get those arrows, they are this side of you. If I say this side of you, then you'll know that it's safe and you can come out and everything's okay. But he said, if I shoot my bow and arrow and I say to the servant, go and get the arrows, they're beyond you. If I say beyond you, then you'll know that it's dangerous and you must run away because it's not safe. So David thought, well, actually, yeah, no, that's a pretty good idea. Well, that's a good sign to use. We'll let him have the conversation with Saul and he'll come and give me the sign for if it's safe or not for me. So out David went. He went to the field and he hid behind this stone. And Jonathan, in the meantime, Jonathan went to his father, King Saul, and he said to him, he said, look, he said, David is a great soldier. And yes, he's become really good and he might be better than you are, but please don't do anything to harm him. Well, at that, Saul got, what did he get? He got angry, and he had angry eyes. And he got so angry and so frustrated with Jonathan that even though he was his son, he threw his sword at him. Now, thankfully, he missed. Phew. But Saul was a man who was violent and who meant what he said. And that's why David was so frightened, because he'd even thrown his sword at his own son. There was no knowing what he'd do to David. So Jonathan, quick as a flash, got up and ran out the palace, taking with him his bow and his arrow. And he called for his servant, and he said to his servant, right, he said, I'm going to fire these arrows. And off he went. He got his bow and arrow like this and put his arrow in, and ping, off went one arrow. And then he got the next one and put it in his bow and arrow, and he fired it far, far, far into the distance. And he said to his servant, go get those arrows. They are beyond you. Now, do you remember what that was a sign for when he said beyond you? If you remember, if you get it right, what he meant when he said they are beyond you was it's not safe. So David heard those words, the arrows are beyond you, and he knew straight away it's not safe for me to be in King Saul's palace. So he stayed hid behind the rock. And Jonathan, he sent his servants to go and collect up all the arrows, and then he sent him with the arrows back to the palace. And once the servant had gone, David came out from behind the rock and he saw Jonathan, and they talked and they realised that it wasn't safe for him, that Saul did mean to kill him. And so he gave his friend Jonathan a great big hug, because he knew he wouldn't see him for a long while. And he was sad. He was going to miss his friend. And David went off. And he went and he wandered, and he went a long way away, and he found a cave where he went and lived in a cave for quite a long while, until he knew it was going to be safe for him to return. And Jonathan had to go back to his father's palace, because that was where he belonged. And so he went back to his palace and he lived there. And sometime later, sadly, Jonathan and Saul were both killed in a battle together. They were fighting in a battle and they were killed. But that's another story, because that story leads to something very special happening to David. And we might just find out about that next week. But what I wanted to talk to you was about friendship, because David and Jonathan were the best of friends and they looked out for each other. That's what was happening in our story. Jonathan desperately didn't want anything to happen for David, so he went to his father and he found out what was happening so that he could tell David, and David would know what to do for the best. He was his friend and he wanted to protect him and care for him because he loved him. Have you got a good friend like that? I've got friends who are like that, who look out for me and who love me. And it's a lovely thing to be a good friend, because that's what being a good friend is all about. It's looking out for your friends and being kind to them and caring about them. How lovely is that? So, thinking about friendship and being good friends, we're going to go next door into the kitchen and we're going to do a craft activity that will make you think all about your friends. See you in a minute.